Sapphire Town, a suburb destroyed by apartheid, was in its heyday known as the Chicago of South Africa, a place where shebeen queens, gangsters, politicians, and black and white bohemians rubbed shoulders and traded drinks in a heady atmosphere fizzing with music, style, and rebellion. This vibrant community produced some of South Africa's most famous musicians, artists, writers, journalists, and politicians as urban African culture formed here during the repressive 1940s and 1950s. Despite the violence and poverty manufactured and enforced by the apartheid system, Sapphire Town was a legendary cultural hub and the epicenter of politics, jazz, and blues. It symbolized a society that allowed a freedom of action, association, and expression, where people lived together in harmony, undivided by race or culture. The very existence of Sapphire Town as a mixed suburb was in direct contradiction to the apartheid policy of geographically separating people according to their race. Its heyday finally ended when the authorities deliberately tore the area apart. On 9th February 1955, Prime Minister D.F. Malan sent 2,000 policemen armed with Sten guns and rifles into Sapphire Town. They destroyed the suburb and removed 60,000 inhabitants and moved them to Meadowlands in Soweto. The houses had no toilets, water, and electricity. This was the Nationalist Party's formula for its brutal Group Areas Act that was aimed to dehumanize black people. The destruction of Sapphire Town and the removal of its people to Meadowlands and other new parts of Soweto provided a subtext for a number of songs. The famous Meadowlands was a testimony to a people's pain and resilience. The song Meadowlands became a protest anthem against the Sapphire Town removals.
It's rather interesting how many different accounts there are of the genesis of Sapphire Town. Some of the facts are indisputable. It was written by Spike Vilakazi, and he was a very well-known and very talented, multi-talented musician and composer, played many instruments, involved himself in the foundation to protect musical rights that became SAMRO at some point. But the point was that there are different accounts of what it meant at the beginning. And there are some accounts which I think are slightly apocryphal, which is that it was written in such a way that it suggested that the people of Sapphire Town, whose houses were being destroyed, were happy to go to Meadowlands. Meadowlands being what we'll call the local name for Meadowlands, and I'm greatly in favor of what we'll call diverse and different Englishes. So yes. Actually part of the meaning of many of the plays was to play with language.
Yeah.
So Meadowlands, again, there were different accounts. When it finally emerges, especially as it emerges in the play Sapphire Town, it's very straightforward. The whites say we must move to Meadowlands, but the Tutsis say we won't go, we won't go, we won't go. But if there's any truth to the original idea that the song was ironic and only understood, if you like, by those who were victims or at the rough end of oppression, whereas the state was willing to celebrate the song because they thought it helped them in their project, the apartheid state, I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. What I do know is that there is also another account which I found fascinating, and we use it in the text, in the performance. And I read somewhere, and I can't be sure where, but it might have been one of the commentators on jazz, that the original was created in waltz time. It was created in 3/4 time. And it was a lament, and it's very slow. It goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And if we can listen to Patrick Shy singing it, the late Patrick Shy, it starts as a lament. It actually says in the text, it must start as a lament. And then there is a switch to 4/4 time, the jazz and upbeat version that we know much more, which is much more popular. And what that symbolized for me in the play was precisely the energy of resistance, that something that is a lament and low key and sad is turned into something full of energy. And that energy is about resistance. And that's why we did it that way in the play.
Sapphire Town, the musical, is an imaginative reconstruction of the Sapphire Town era. The production was originally created by Malcolm Perkey and his Junction Avenue Theatre Company. The production became an instant hit and scooped multiple awards, and the production has been reprised several times. In 2017, the South African State Theatre revived the theatre classic Sapphire Town, delighting the day's audiences with its timeless music, featuring a new, young cast under the direction of award-winning playwright and director Aubrey Segabi. The revived version was again reprised in 2018 and 2019. In 1963, internationally celebrated South African songbird Miriam Makeba, who went into exile, gave a stirring testimony before the United Nations about the atrocities of apartheid.
It was to arouse the conscience of the world. It was not only through her speech, but it was through her performances. It was through the songs that she sang. And not only Miriam Makeba, but artists all over the world. And I mean, people like Harry Belafonte were responsible for conscientizing, awakening the conscience of the people all over the world. For many years, people like Belafonte did not start with a cultural boycott, but started in the late 50s, to speak against apartheid. And practically churches, everybody was working. And it was a campaign that was designed and defined by our president of the African National Congress at the time, Oliver Tambo. But definitely the work of artists spoke much, much, much louder than many speeches that were made, and helped to bring the message to a much wider group of people, including people who would not otherwise, because they were not politicians, but because these artists had fans, their fans in addition, spread the word. School children, everybody was involved.
Like Miriam Makeba, author, academic, and cultural activist Barbara Masekela too addressed meetings and organized campaigns during the years when she and her internationally renowned brother Hugh Masekela were in exile and part of a team which constructed an anti-apartheid movement that galvanized millions of people to wage a war against apartheid.
Well, I was the head of the African National Congress Department of Arts and Culture. But it was a huge department, and it had many branches in London, Sweden, wherever the ANC had a presence. So I was one of a team with people like Lindiwe Mabuza, Wally Serute, Willie Khositsile, Mandla Langa. There were many of us, and we were all working in the groups that were prosecuting the cultural boycott. We were aiming to isolate South Africa, and the end all of it was also to make sure that no artist performed in South Africa, or diplomats came to South Africa, or academics. It was sports people. So it was part of the whole sanctions movement. And the sanctions movement started really on an economic level. But as the struggle progressed, it became very clear that culture was the one method of fighting that could bring about immediate results, and also that artists all over the world, whether they were painters, singers, sculptors, whatever, you know, artists, creative people joined together in solidarity with South African artists and the anti-apartheid movement to isolate the apartheid regime. So I was nearly one of many hundreds of people who were working together to isolate the apartheid regime. And my role was that I was in Lusaka, I headed the department. So obviously we coordinated with other people, our chief representatives in some of the countries I've mentioned. We coordinated with artist organizations to bring things together. And of course, I mean, you know that, for instance, when Nelson Mandela was finally released, there was a big concert. But before then, there had been concerts of artists against apartheid. There had been art exhibitions all over the world. There'd been conferences, Midu in Botswana, Casa in Amsterdam, the cultural boycott festival in Sweden, and all over the world. Really, people were organizing, artists wherever they were organizing smaller events, but nonetheless that targeted their people, you know, to work against apartheid. It was not only, I mean, art was one of the weapons against apartheid. It may have been one of the most effective, but there were other weapons. There was armed struggle. The cultural boycott was part of the international movement to anti-apartheid movement to isolate the apartheid regime. So art was, you know, one of the ways in which we did. And as I said, there was armed struggle, there was mobilization within the country. Yeah, so that's the way it was.
As the apartheid government began to collapse and a new dawn of democracy became inevitable in South Africa, Barbara Masekela and Hugh Masekela ended their exile abroad and returned to South Africa.
Hugh Masekela, together with Miriam Makeba and many of the other South African artists, did a marvelous job in alerting people, in appealing to people, in showing people what was happening with apartheid in South Africa. And of course, with Hugh, we also have a situation where he composed songs, you know, against apartheid, like, you know, Bring Back Nelson Mandela, Stimela, you know, and many, many other songs, you know, that he composed, which were, sometimes they were songs like Chileshe, which were against, you know, xenophobia, you know, that he composed. It was in his album, for instance, like Colonial Man, which many people don't know about, but in that album, it was really basically an album that explored the role of certain personalities in colonizing South Africa and colonizing Africa. But it was like, that is an example of a work of art that came before its time, you know, because at the time it was the height of the Cold War, and people who did not want us to succeed with freedom always pointed to the fact of our relationship with people whom they regarded as their enemy, people in the then Soviet Union, the communist world. So all they had to do is to point at you and say you were a communist in order to shut up the message that you were giving. But in reality, as we can see, they were not successful, because these works of art were able to convey in a very cogent and powerful manner that apartheid was wrong, that apartheid from its inception, with colonization was wrong, and that people had a right to their freedom. And I think if you look at South African jazz and music in general, you will see that informally and formally, but also much more informally, people used art to speak against the inequalities and the oppression that Black people were suffering in South Africa. And it's not something that was invented in South Africa. It's being done all over the world and had been, It was a question that in the 60s, because of the popularity of artists, public artists, that the whole change took place. Because if you look at it carefully, you see that the anti-war movement also was about songs, against war. And people like Miriam and Hugh, etc., participated with other artists in fighting segregation, for instance. Hugh and Miriam were very active in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s in the United States, raising funds, bringing people's attention, to the issue of racial discrimination. So it was a natural thing for them to do this about their own country, South Africa. And we know even today, a hip hop artist or a rapper sometimes can have immediate effect on people, and they understand something very immediately that it would take them a very long time through a long 3-hour speech by a politician explaining the same thing.
True.
Yeah.
The return of the Masekelas to South Africa after years in exile was a momentous occasion in which millions of South Africans rejoiced that South Africa's sons and daughters had finally returned to the land of their ancestors. It was inevitable that Hugh Masekela would be sought after to perform on South African stages, but also be interviewed by media for his iconic role along with songstress Miriam Makeba for their struggles for social justice. Hugh Masekela's life, along with so many South African musicians who went into exile, is an essential part of South African cultural history. In building a new democracy, it is imperative that the legacies of these iconic giants who represented the South African liberation struggle to the world is not lost. Singer, songwriter and actress Mara Lowe has toured the world extensively, taking both South African music and our aspiration for a democratic South Africa to wherever she has performed. In 1988, on Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday, she performed in a concert to support the anti-apartheid movement. In 1973, Mara Lowe joined Caiphus Semenya's musical Maropa and toured Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, South Africa and London, and sang for the Queen at a Royal Command performance in 1975. Whilst the global community honoured South Africa's musicians at home, the apartheid government offered no support for black jazz musicians. The lack of support from the apartheid state, however, did not deter black musicians from sustaining the music through an active series of performances in informal venues, including shebeens. Sam Mathe is a leading South African cultural historian and journalist. His recent publication, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond, is a well-researched, articulate, and comprehensive documentation of South African jazz history and the role that South Africa's jazz musicians have brought to South Africa's transformation agenda.
About Sam Mathe's book, I believe it is a haven of information about facts and anecdotes that paint a vivid picture of an artist's life and background. We need more of this kind of documenting. And the reason we talk so much about artists from other societies, it is because those societies document the diverse facets of their jazz evolution and the players inside it. But they also document it as the people that love the music, not just as educators or intellectuals or even academics in the community halls, but just as normal people on the streets. They have stories to tell about this wonderful music.
Sam Mathe's book, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond, is one of the most comprehensive books written about South African music over the last decade, in South Africa at least. His background as a journalist, his ability to research, his incredible knowledge of South African culture and of the political environment and the landscape in which people create work has made the book such a wonderful and a valued document. This book needs to be a resource available in all schools and institutions where young people want to learn about music and about South African cultural history.
In March 2022, at the time of the Writer Festival presented by the Centre for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Sam Mathe moderated a roundtable discussion featuring authors Barbara Masekela, Mara Lowe, and Des Lindberg to discuss the role played by South Africa's music icons in the liberation struggle. Whilst he gave a voice to their work, the Artfluencing Democracy Dialogues chooses to probe and engage with Sam Mathe's book, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond.
You have played a vital role in producing your book, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond, documenting the lives and careers of South African jazz musicians. As one of the most informed journalists in South Africa about the history of jazz in South Africa, you're an expert to discuss how South African jazz musicians have contributed to South Africa's liberation during the apartheid and how they have continued to be ambassadors for democracy and human rights in South Africa. So that's what we had to say about
you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. You're very kind.
All right. So what's your inspiration for writing the book?
I guess more than anything else is the passion, the love for the music.
Yes.
From childhood, I've actually been following South African jazz, and I've been an avid collector as well.
Yes.
From the era of the cassettes until the CDs, I've been collecting since I was a student, and so people like Abdul Ibrahim, Tola Brand, Miriam, they left a very huge impression on me. And I thought, well, these are great musicians, but where are the books documenting their lives? There were a few biographies here and there, but I needed something that I could call a group kind of portrait of these musicians.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's interesting you say something like that, where you're saying that some of the South African history, especially in the arts, has not been captured properly, And I think that you capturing that, because we struggle to find, when we go online, we struggle to find relevant and proper information about things. When you do research, you kind of have to go out of your way really to find out what really happened to this star. Yeah, it's a big struggle. Yeah,
it's a big struggle.
Yeah. So to our next question, how did you go about researching for the book?
Well, I'll say the music itself was the start. The little snippets that I'll read on the, whether it was the cassettes or the CDs. But again, you know, I must tell you this, during the era of the LPs, you'll have some notes, you know, some comprehensive notes on the music and the artist. But that is all in the past. I mean, I was just a child then. And that sort of information, I think, has been phased out when, you know, with the introduction of the CDs. So it was a struggle, as I've indicated, to use that material, you know, for research. But the interviews played a very huge role. But, you know, of course, got its own shortcomings, especially when it comes to memory. Some of these musicians were old; they couldn't remember much, you know. So yeah, in terms of documented material, you know, in the libraries and all that, there wasn't much. So that was a challenge. So you have to go around and get those who are still around and try and talk to them. If in the case where they've since passed on, you had to get some information from family, and I did that. Yeah.
So you just really, you compile the book with the scraps you were just really given, basically.
Yeah, the scraps that I'll get. You know, when I go to a cemetery during a burial, and then I say some headstone with the dates and all that, and then I'll use that.
So you went around just looking for stuff, random stuff about
random stuff,
and you put it together.
Exactly. So yeah, and during the interviews, like radio interviews, TV interviews, you listen, you try to find something from the interviews. So you know, it was just a variety of sources in that regard.
Yeah. So how long did that take you to just put everything together?
I've been doing this since the early 2000s, more specifically, I think. Yeah. 2005 to be more precise. So from 2005, I was a working journalist. In other words, I was a full-time journalist. But at the same time, because there wasn't much in terms of like the workload, so I thought I could do something on the side. And then I started with the writing, the actual writing, you know, where I'll have a format. I had to ask myself what I wanted, and so what readily came to mind was stuff like dates of birth, where the person was, when the person was born, where, and if they've passed on, I needed that as well. And then I also needed the discography, what they've contributed in terms of the music itself. And then other stuff, you know, gradually fell into place. So let's say for an individual profile, I'll have, for a start, I'll have maybe 200 weights. And after a year or so, I'll have 1,000. So I was building on that until 15 years later, around, let's say 2017, I realized that, okay, I felt I could publish. And also when I started, I had a target in terms of the number. I think I wanted to at least start with about 200 entries. And then with time, there was a new generation that was coming in, and then I decided to add them. And I think with the new generation, the information was at least much more easier, because the publicists had it, and then, you know, you could interview the musicians and stuff like that. That is why I have artists, for instance, as young as those who were born in the 90s. I've got somebody, Zoe Mudiha, born in 1994. She was she's the youngest in the book. So all in all, I've got about 4 generations.
Journalist and jazz enthusiast Atiya Khan, writing for New Frame, described Sam Mathe's highly acclaimed book as a tribute to hundreds of South African musicians who are a forgotten memory, as well as the younger generation currently performing. She further described Sam Mathe's book as a stretching back over 4 generations of musicians from the 1920s to the present, It paints intimate biographical portraits of jazz, folk, and pop artists. Heavyweights such as Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, Lucky Dube, Brenda Fassie, Abdullah Ibrahim, Dorothy Masuka, Leto Mbulu, and Johnny Diani are among those featured, while the styles of music include Marabi, Kwela, Mbaqanga, free jazz, and contemporary sounds. While Sam Mathe's book continues to garner both national and international accolades, he experienced various funding challenges with both the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture and the National Arts Council while trying to complete the project.
You know, strange enough, in 2017, when I thought I was ready to publish, one of the officials actually invited me, you know, for a chat, and then so that we could talk about funding, which came through, but you know, it wasn't much. It was something for, let's say, for research purposes. But you know, I still needed more. So that money came through eventually after a long struggle, and that was when I realized that funding for writers and artists in this country is a huge challenge, because there's no guarantee. You see, you can apply, and then after applying, you are told that you are one of the successful applicants.
Yes.
But for whatever reasons, that money it seldom comes out. It is seldom made available for the papers. I won't go much into details. People have different, you know, theories about why. You know, one of those the kickbacks. Sometimes it seems one has to pay something to, you know. So I don't do that.
Yeah.
So I really struggled in that regard. And so it's a whole story on itself, how I went through trying to get funding from both the Department of Arts and Culture and the National Arts Council. Also, another problem is, let's say you have a particular figure, for instance, 300,000, and they'll just give you, let's say, 30,000. They won't even discuss with you the costs, the actual costs in rents and cents. You know, they'll just slash a zero there, and then you're just left with nothing. So those were some of the things that I went through. Foreign governments seem to appreciate us more. They appreciate the heritage that South Africa has left for the world, compared to us as people who are actually supposed to be at the forefront of promoting this heritage.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's so ironic, but it's so sad. It's just sad.
Yes.
Whilst the title of Sam Mathe's book, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond, is inspired by the name of Kippies Morolong Moketsi, the famous South African clarinetist and alto saxophonist who is considered to be the father of South African jazz, the Kippies Jazz Bar, which was once a vibrant jazz hub in the heart of Newtown, no longer exists. The building stands lonesome in the Market Theatre precinct, and a bronze statue of Kippies Morolong is forlorn.
I remember, I'll say my first memory of Kippies was not the space itself.
Yeah.
But it was the music. I was passing, you know, I was going from Braamfontein. I was a student at the time, and I was in the neighborhood, the Market Theatre neighborhood. And then I heard this music. It was one of the best sounds, one of the most beautiful sounds I've ever heard. And then I said to my friend, "What is happening there?" He said, "There's a place called Kippies that play, you know, in the evening, so on weekends they usually play there." And I said, "Yeah, I've read about this Kippies, you know, but I didn't know." And the first time I saw it, it was it looked so small for its reputation. I mean, it was always in the newspapers, and it had the reputation of being an international jazz venue. And here I just saw this small place, you know. When I started attending the shows, it was not easy because it was always packed.
Yeah,
it was always packed. But I remember this particular one, I think it was around early 2000, when Brasipo Sipoma was a manager there. And then he organized a concert, which he dubbed a reunion concert, because if you recall, he has long gone solo sometime in the 80s, mid 80s. He left a group called Harare. So what happened there is that they were playing together. They came together with the original members of Harare. They played with him. That for me was something that was just out of this world. Just to see those musicians, I grew up listening to on the radio, just to see them performing, and particularly performing together with that. So yeah, if I have to select a memory, I would say that was the memory for me. Yeah, there were so many anyway, but the Sikoma Buse concept with the former Harare members was something.
My favorite memory about Kippies Jazz Bar in Johannesburg is that, I used to come to Johannesburg from Mafikeng, where I worked at Radio Bob. And I was always hit square in the face, by the vibrant atmosphere of Newtown. At the time, the Yard of Ale was buzzing. The Market Theatre had incredible programming that was bold and forthright. And, places such as Rosebank on the other side, the atmosphere, the clubs such as Picasso, and incredible jazz bars to buy records from, everything was just about feeding people culturally. And I was mesmerized by all these colorful people, celebrities, and all of that, just creating this vibrant culture. But one day I happened to walk into Kippies very quietly. It was a quiet night and there was a small band on stage. I believe it was a trio, if I recall. But it was just that, that blue light, that quiet atmosphere, and this elegant music that was coming off the stage. And there was this lovely pianist, it was Moses Molelekwa, and this incredible man, a vocalist, the late Shaluza Maxim Dambo. And I don't remember who was the other band member, but I will recall one day. But it was one of the most striking moments for me where I realized how sacred a jazz club really is.
Personally, I don't have much faith anymore in government involvement, especially in venues such as this. I mean, when the orbit started, even Kippies itself, I think this were private initiatives, or other initiatives by private individuals. Yeah. Kippies started when there was no government.
Yeah.
This was during apartheid, and ironically, they were doing well. They were even able to have some of the top class musicians from abroad to come in and play. Those were difficult times, but they were able to get venues like those going.
Johannesburg is South Africa's economic hub. The cosmopolitan city ought to be filled with theatres, galleries, and jazz venues. Unfortunately, the Johannesburg Art Gallery, an entity of the Johannesburg Metropolitan Council, is in a state of desperate neglect. Jazz bars, on the other hand, have suffered a worse fate, with inadequate public funding, and as a result have shut down. The Orbit, which opened its doors in 2014, shut down in 2019. The owners issued a statement that was one of the saddest obituaries for the promotion of jazz music in South Africa. The statement read, "It is with great sadness that we announce the closure of the Orbit Live Music and Bistro. We have, unfortunately, not been able to overcome the financial constraints that we have found with running a live music venue like the Orbit. We had hoped to attract more investment, but has proven difficult with the type of business that we are and the current financial realities in the country."
In other countries, Germany, for instance, you have venues that the state is directly involved in the running of clubs, such as Kippies, for instance. Yeah. In other words, I'll say annually they will receive a certain amount of funding to run that. I haven't heard about that in this country.
Yeah.
So I think we could have gone far if there was an annual kind of stipend, that takes care of rental, remuneration for staff, and other day-to-day needs, of such establishments. Yeah. So it's like, you are doing it on your own, and with time, I think private sector also, somehow retreated a bit, because in the past it was mainly private sector that was behind this, but the government, again, they could have done that far better, because we have the mandate, actually, particularly the mandate of specific departments like arts and culture, is to keep these institutions running. So and they get budgets, annual budgets in that regard. So it's strange why we keep on having these beautiful venues, but unfortunately they don't last.
I'd like to repeat the question on the proverbial jazz question: how do you keep venues such as Kippies and the Orbit from closure? I strongly believe in patronage as the cornerstone of keeping the pulse of an art beating. Patronage in its various meanings, whether it's paying for your seat, whether it's participating in donations when needed, essentially putting your money where your mouth is. So as the consumer, there is an interest for you in terms of ensuring that a place that you enjoy because it provides the art that you love, to make sure that it keeps yielding, the qualities that you want. It's not just the place of the people that have started or are running the venue, but the patrons themselves should be interested. But we also need to educate ourselves why art is important to us, and therefore why we need to live around it and about it. And I believe it's the question of the state in itself. What kind of nation are we trying to build? How do these places contribute to society, and how, as a state, we can create a way in which we can keep them sustained? And that is by choosing how we invest in it. The people that drive those investments should be people articulate in the running of those spaces. It should not be political appointees, which is sadly what is happening here at home.
In Pretoria, the South African State Theatre plays a vital role in developing and promoting South African jazz alongside the rest of its cultural programming. Legislated as a cultural institution in terms of the Cultural Institutions Act No. 119 of 1998, the theatre's CEO, Dr. Sibongiseni Mkhize, along with artistic director Aubrey Segabi, anchor jazz programming as a vital element to showcase, celebrate, and develop the South African jazz industry.
Well, jazz shows do contribute to our mandate. Actually, even before there was a proclamation by UNESCO in 2011 of the International Jazz Month and the date of the 30th of April, whereas the State Theatre had always made sure that jazz is part of our artistic program. And our artistic offerings, as you might be aware, they actually touch on the issues that relate to social change, promotion of dialogue, artistic expression, and the promotion of peace and unity. And the shows that we present on stage are meant to do that, but also to develop young people and to contribute to social cohesion. I think the kind of support that is being given to musicians, especially jazz musicians, is very minuscule when compared to the contribution of jazz musicians to the attainment of our democracy. And I think the government of today needs to invest more, but also us as institutions of arts, culture and heritage, especially the State Theatre, we should be forging more partnerships with jazz musicians. And I think that's what we are already doing through our program, because we understand that there are synergies, especially with regard to matters that relate to social change, unity, social cohesion, and also in line with our own identity as the South African State Theatre and the philosophy in our artistic program. So I think more should be done in terms of provision of spaces, support financially, but also the establishment of the jazz academies and the support of those academies that will actually make sure that the next generation of young people also participate, and also our community and society at large enjoy the benefit of jazz music, because it's not just about entertainment, it's about a deep reflection on our history as the people of South Africa, because jazz has played a very pivotal role on the journey to the establishment of a new South Africa.
The South African State Theatre's artistic director, Aubrey Segabi, is a multi-award-winning playwright and director. Since taking reign at the South African State Theatre, his visionary artistic programming has buried the cultural ghosts that occupied this theatre that was once a part of apartheid's grand design.
The South African State Theatre has always been a home for the arts. We've hosted so many programs. I think we ran a program for about 10 years. Jazz and African Music Night, and at that time we've really put on our stages most of the South African jazz artists. So it has really been our mission, our vision to profile art. It's always, people have always said Tshwane is the home of jazz, so we wanted to live up to that. That's why we've had Jazz and African Music Nights. But we look at things like virtuosity, we look at things like access. I remember when we started Jazz and African Music Nights, which was actually, I think, started by Vusi Foundation, and was then followed up by Wade Ranoto, and he worked hand in hand with us. When he came to me, he actually wanted to do a platform for young artists, and I said, can we also put on professionals? But by profiling young artists, we are saying we are preparing the future generation of jazz artists. So it is all those, it's access, it's relevance, because culture evolves. And we wanted to really bring up young people up to speed. Most of the people that you'll be seeing today on our stages, they have been on the development program of Jazz and African Night. So we look at those things. We look at talent. I try to set the artists free. And different artists have different approaches to their work. They communicate different stories. So you don't want to say, hey, we're going to do this one because he's telling such stories, and we're not going to do this one. But we are saying, is this a skillful artist? Is this an artist who really wants to grow and develop their careers? Is this an artist who wants to fulfill ambition? And I believe that as the South African State Theatre, we are able and all the time to provide such platforms for those artists. Quite a lot. We've done such a lot of artists whose music and voice contributes to a social justice. Some of them are no longer with us today. People like Brahima Sikela, may rest in peace. At the time, even Zim Ngawan, I think Zim, by the time he passed on, he was actually was supposed to perform at our theatre, I think, in a week's time. But you look at the State Theatre in the past couple of months, really, 2022, we've had Thandiswa Mazwai Letters for Azania, right here in the Opera Theatre. When we brought in Somi, reimagining Makeba, there was just like all these amazing artists, jazz artists that she brought onto our stages. Nduzima Katini, Zoe Mudiha, fresh, young, imaginative, bring the spirituality into that, it's identity. So we have really done a lot of those. Seeing Brahot Sticks Mabuza on our stages, knowing the role that they played in the in terms of jazz music in our country. So we have really put on a lot of artists. Even from Tshwane itself. You have Ngamisa, who was also part of Sast Fringe One, Bed with Melodies, and also covering some of the amazing artists like Dark City Sisters number that she covered. Somi, was also reimagining Makeba and doing those things. You also have Zoe, who has done Ilanga Lishonile by Makeba. You can see who they're paying homage to is those people whose music has traveled the world and has told the world about the injustices of apartheid. So we have put on quite a lot of musicians who have a voice and who wants to make a change and who has a story a story to tell. Bokang Daya, I think, has also been on our stages. Sure, there's just quite a list of them. I can go on and on saying who has been on our stages. At some point, we had Simpiwe Dana, so you can see that they stand for something. She's an activist in her own right. They do stand for something. They do have a voice against social injustice. So I think we continue to do such. I think Mamswungile Kumalo, may she rest in peace. I think one of her final concerts, she did it here in the Opera Theatre during lockdown. Those are the people with a voice. Those are the people that says, let's fight on. We got to keep on fighting. We got to come together. It's people who got to point out when things are not right in our community. We got to use all the tools that we have at our disposal. Some are dramatists, some are painters, and music and jazz has always had that special place in our hearts as a theatre, but in South African hearts, because if you remember even, the Group Areas Act, in the 50s, where the musicians could not work together, black musicians had to work by themselves, white musicians, you couldn't perform in certain areas. You look at what happened in Sapphire Town, how music just simply evolved. A lot of the people went to exile because of the messages that they were sending, also because of the injustice that was happening in their country, where you cannot perform here, you can only perform here, you cannot do this, you can only do this. And musicians, they need freedom. So I think we coming from that culture, and we are inspired by those people who made those contributions. That the Jonas Gwangwa, may rest in peace, has also been on our stages and put up some work that the Kefas Semenya. When you think about the music that they created, even for Roots back in the days, and coming back today and telling those stories and inspiring young people. So I'd say that there's been quite a lot of those people in state theatre. As a Pan-African theatre with a Pan-African outlook, we have consistently put on those sort of artists. Brahu was the deputy CEO of the State Theatre, I think in the 90s, post-apartheid. He was here for some time. He brought in a lot of content, of jazz content, of music content here at the South African State Theatre. And I think shortly after he left, I actually got involved with him, and as I was trying to write his story, Eitada, I think he wrote a book now, Still Grazing. Most of that information one had already collected through interviews, because he wanted to make a musical. That musical still has not been made. I think even before COVID, as a State Theatre, we had that musical on our program, Still Grazing. Still has not materialized. I hope that one day it can materialize. So I had a lot of engagement with him when I was doing Eitada and creating it. I was younger then. So the conversations kept on going, and then at some point he wanted to do Songs of Migration. It wasn't called Songs of Migration when we originally presented it. We originally presented it in the arena here, but he wanted to tell the story of music, of South African music, from back in the day, and trace it, and what the migrants brought when they come here, what they took with them when they went abroad, in terms of the music, what they learned abroad, and they came back here. So we created that musical. Originally it was supposed to be directed by Sello Magega Mngube. It was eventually directed by James Mobo, and then it played here in the arena, and then it went to the Market Theatre. When it played here, it was actually called the Rehearsal or something like that. And then it went to the Market Theatre, and it was called Songs of Migration. It had a powerful cast, and obviously that Brahu behind it. James is the artistic director of the Market Theatre, making it, and they produced it, and I think it went abroad. But Brahu just he had this passion for telling stories. He had this passion for musical theatre in South Africa. So that's how that conversation came about, and I think our chief executive officer at the time was Manduneni Ngema. I called this one Duneni Ngema, and she was also the producer. I think she eventually produced it when it left the State Theatre, and when she also left the State Theatre, they proceeded with the work. We are no longer involved at that point in time, but we actually built the production from the State Theatre. One could say it's actually a State Theatre production, and it could have. I hope it did carry. I'm not quite sure if it carried that credit throughout, but that's what it was supposed to have happened. But it was indeed a State Theatre production.
Mamelodi Township's very own jazz composer and vocalist, Amisa Nkana, performed at the Women's Month Celebration Concert Series, which took place at the State Theatre in August 2021 under the banner, The Year of Charlotte Manyamatleke, Realizing Women's Rights. The music event, which headlined Amy Faku, was aimed at celebrating the women of 1956 and countless others that set the tone for gender equality and empowerment in a democratic South Africa. In November 2021, Xemisa appeared on SAST Fringe, which is the State Theatre's cutting-edge music platform profiling unconventional talent in the country's music scene. Founded in the height of COVID-19 lockdowns, the program was established by the theatre to offer COVID-19 relief and mass employment when the environment limited artists to practice. Winner of the 6th UNISA piano competition, pianist Thabiso Mfana featured in 2018-2019 season of the South African State Theatre's Incubator program, where he debuted the Blue State of Mind, an offering of his 12 daring original compositions. For Thabiso Mfana, the exploration of tensions between upholding the values of the jazz tradition with the inherent yearning of a young artist for innovation and relevance is often at the core of his work. In April 2021, the New School Sextet performed in Season 1 of the South Africa State Theatre's SAS Fringe, the theatre's music platform profiling unconventional talent in the country's music scene. The group's objectives include encouraging a broader spectrum of youth to engage with social development through music. The group creates music programs for youth centers to raise awareness in society about social issues.
This is the one I want you all to sing along with me back home. It's so easy. And don't think I can't hear you not singing. It goes like this. Oh, 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 oh. You got it? Smiling sweetly, stand up first to greet me.
The development of jazz talent in South Africa is at the core of the Standard Bank Young Artists Program presented by the National Arts Festival in Makhanda. The list of South African jazz musicians who have received the prestigious accolade during their early careers over the past 3 decades and more runs like a roll call of honor.
Justify that life, 'cause I know fake hearts won't find the kind of love I will find in time, Fake minds won't find the kind of beauty here inside. Fake minds won't find. Are you ready to sing? Come on. Oh, 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 oh.
Winners of the Standard Bank Young Artists Award are given the prestigious honor of performing on the main jazz program at the National Arts Festival in Makhanda, Grahamstown. Jazz Festival Director Alan Webster is at the forefront of recognizing talent in its prime and catapulting such talent into the international arena. Several jazz musicians who have performed at the Standard Bank Jazz Festival in Makhanda are now known household brands and continue to play a significant role in advancing South Africa's cultural identity abroad. The Cape Town International Jazz Festival is held in and around the Cape Town International Convention Centre on Cape Town's foreshore. The festival is the 4th biggest jazz festival in the world and the largest music event in sub-Saharan Africa, drawing in an excess of 35,000 fans every year. The organizers put together an incredible lineup of performers and jazz virtuosos who grace the stages of Africa's grandest gathering over the 2 show days. The Jazz on the Lake Festival in Johannesburg is a signature project of the city's Arts Alive Festival. Presented as one of South Africa's most successful jazz festivals, the annual event is free for all and it presents an array of South African and international jazz artists. In KwaZulu-Natal, well-known jazz musician and educator Natalie Rangan is at the forefront of promoting jazz music amongst young people.
South Africa has such a rich heritage of music culture, and it's a hybrid of many, many different styles that comes together. So when we choose musicians to be a part of this festival, we're very deliberate in who we want our students exposed to, and particular about the face of those musicians. So past years, we've had people like Ernie Smith, who is a Summer Award winner and KZN based, to encourage our students on this journey of becoming a professional musician. This year, we hosted Prince Bulo, Sibusiso Mashawane, and Sean Johannes, who was actually the leader of the first KZN Schools Jazz Band. For students to have interaction with musicians of this caliber is priceless, because they wouldn't get this on an ordinary basis. So this festival is aimed at actually giving them access to not just the musicians themselves, but to the music that they create, living mentors as we call them. But these musicians are also very deliberate in the choice of music that they expose students to. They use South African music, people like Hugh Masekela, Abdullah Ibrahim. That's the type of music that we want our students to be exposed to, so they know what's in our country, the sound that we hope that they develop in as living, as being a part of this music culture that we are trying to develop in KZN. The reason I started this festival was when I engaged with music teachers around the province. I discovered that there aren't many schools who teach jazz. So the aim of this particular festival is to develop jazz education in the province and to expose students to what jazz education is, the heritage that we have as South African musicians, with jazz being so much a part of South African society and our past history. And it's to create platforms for musicians to expose their talent and also to expose young talent to new audiences. Basically, the festival is aimed at young talent in KZN and how to develop that talent. And the way that we're doing this is very much following the formula that the National Youth Schools Festival follows in Makanda, and that's using professional musicians to both mentor and teach young musicians and to help them along this journey of becoming a professional musician. So the KZN Schools Jazz and Rock Music Festival is aimed at KZN students and how to develop them and their talent, to provide a platform for them, and also to provide a platform for KZN artists as mentors and musicians in their own province, for people to know what we have and what we have to offer as musicians.
At the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Center for Jazz and Contemporary Music is a dynamic platform that provides professional training for South Africa's jazz musicians. Headed by jazz musician Neil Gonsalves, the center plays a vital role in celebrating South Africa's jazz legacies.
My name is Neil Gonsalves. I'm a musician, a composer, arranger, pianist, and a jazz educator. I'm lecturer in jazz studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where I'm also the director for the Center for Jazz and Popular Music. The work that I do at the center is simply the continuation of the work of my predecessors. And the founder for the center was Professor Darius Brubeck, who also started up the jazz program at the University of Natal in 1983. It was the first jazz program on the African continent. And South Africa in 1983 was a very different place. Still under apartheid, Darius was bringing black students into this academic space, and through a jazz program also bringing township culture into the space. The center, which started in 1989, was also the same year that I got to the university to study music. Actually, I got to university in 1988, when you study computer science, but I was a disaster as a computer science student and found my way to the music department. One of the things that I found about the music department was it was so much more diverse. Most of my contemporaries in music, and specifically in jazz, were black. And so this notion of kind of free association, which is a fundamental human right, was something that I got to experience firsthand. The center doesn't advocate directly for human rights, but it is housed within an academic department, the music department. And it is a performance space where the notion of freedom of expression is something that we celebrate. The center used to be known as the Center for Jazz, and then subsequently became known as the Center for Jazz and Popular Music. And maybe one of the things that I've kind of adopted through my own musical history, because even though I was trained as a jazz musician and love to play jazz, teach jazz, I've also had the benefit of playing lots of different kinds of music, lots of different kinds of popular music, and also played lots of Afro beat, played with people like Busi Mshlongo and Johnny Clegg and so on. So it has been one of the things that I've really pushed for, is to make our programming at the center much more diverse, so that everyone has a home at the center in terms of whatever musical genre it is that they play in. They can come and play at the center. So we've had artists from Indian classical music, Maskandi music, Afrobeat musicians, house musicians, hip-hop musicians, all kinds of musicians come to play at the center. And I think this diversifying of the program is also something that that represents what the center has always been about. Because when you come to the center, you'll find that there's always a very broad demographic in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of culture, in almost every single way you can imagine. Lots of international students that come to the university also often come through to the center. One of the things that we've done, especially now over COVID, is that we've collaborated and partnered with many different kinds of organizations to try and yield a positive effect in our society, to raise money for all kinds of woes, trials and tribulations that have come with the global pandemic. So whether that's raising money for autistic children, abused children, for Lifeline, the Dennis Hurley Center was feeding the homeless. Those are all things that are basic human rights. We've partnered also with Amnesty International to raise money for them. And especially when you consider what's going on now with the war in Ukraine, you can see how all of this kind of stuff has to do with fundamental human rights. And even though that's not our core business, it is something that we partner in as part of our core function. But like I say, I mean, that's kind of always been the function of the center. Darius was doing that kind of work, going into the townships, taking the sound of the music into those places, which is where the music also comes from. Winter Marsalis, the famous jazz trumpet player, describes jazz as a model for democracy. So it's intrinsic in the music, the work that we are doing. As a jazz musician, I think one of the greatest challenges that I face is the notion of a dwindling audience. I've spent most of my life developing a certain vocabulary, a language. So it becomes more and more challenging when you find that there's fewer and fewer people who understand the language or actually want to listen to the music. And so the thing that I would like to see change is to see more arts education in our schools, because I think that this is not simply about teaching young people how to become musicians or fine artists. but that intrinsic in art is the notion of being empathetic. You learn as a musician how to listen. This is one of the most fundamental things, especially when you're playing in ensembles and so on. So this is one of the things that I would like to see change, because I think it is a long-term investment in terms of our future. And for aspiring jazz musicians, I would encourage them actually to study the music. To study formally, but also to find the masters, and they are masters. Those masters are not necessarily formally trained, but they carry the tradition of the music with them. So I think it's important to find that balance between a formal and what we call an informal education, because the knowledge of jazz is in our communities. Like I say, there's a township culture, and I think it's important to be connected to that, to find the people who speak this language, who are masters of the language, and then to go through that traditional process, the notion of an oral tradition, master and apprenticeship. These things are living traditions, and it is really what enriches our society.
Since the ending of the international cultural boycott against South Africa in 1992, South Africa has been embraced by the global community in celebrating Jazz Appreciation Month. Founded in 2021 by John Hassey, a curator of the Smithsonian Museum in the US, Jazz Appreciation Month has become a global phenomenon to celebrate jazz music and to honor jazz musicians whose voices outfluence our dialogues for democracy.
I am an executive committee member for SAJE, and I currently hold the portfolio of interim treasurer. So my job is fairly easy in that I oversee the spending of the organization. I also have to fundraise, which is one of the more difficult tasks. And much like any jazz band, we're a democratically run sort of all hands on deck, all involved, like-minded, passionate, motivated group of jazz educators, jazz appreciators, jazz practitioners from across the country. The main purpose of the South African Association for Jazz Education, SAJE, is to promote jazz music and jazz education in South Africa. We have a wonderful website which you can visit at www.saje.org.za.
South Africa's jazz history is as complex as South Africa's political history. Nowhere in recent times has it been told more articulately than in Sam Mathe's book, From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond. The legacy of jazz in South Africa is a gift that ought to be endowed to future generations of South Africans. It is for this reason alone that the Artfluencing Democracy Dialogues asked the question, why did Sam Mathe have to struggle to secure funding for his book From Kippies to Kippies and Beyond from the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture? But more so, now that the book is published, why is there hardly any activism to ensure that this invaluable book about South Africa's jazz legacy is available in every South African high school?